This will be the first of 3 lectures covering the novel My Antonia by Willa Cather. It's the third of a trilogy that's come to be known as the Prairie novels that Cather wrote, not because the characters are the same or the story spans all 3 books, but because they all took place out on the Great Plains, around Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado, where Cather grew up. Her early childhood mirrors that of the narrator of My Antonia. She was born in Virginia, but her family moved to the town of Red Cloud, Nebraska, when she was 9 years old. At the time, many were moving out west into the Great Plains to establish their own farms and lands. The U.S. government was actually encouraging them to do so. There was a series of acts called the Homestead Acts between, 1860 and all the way up into the 1930s, which allowed applicants to buy, or in some cases not to buy, government land for cheap or for free, on the condition that they would settle the land and start farms. And there were a couple of reasons for this. Well, I guess there always is when the government's handing stuff out for free, right? One of the reasons was that the government didn't want southern slave owners buying up all of the farmland and preventing individual northern farmers from getting any, which was a fear before the Civil War. And then once the Civil War began, the Homestead Act of 1862 made the addition that you could only apply for this free land if you had never taken up arms against the United States government. And maybe it was thought that this would deter some farmers from joining the Confederate side, kind of bribing them to remain loyal. After the war, there was an attempt to get freed black Americans to take up the offer so that they could own their own farms as well. And meanwhile, immigrants from all over the world were making their way west too, hearing about the good offer. Now, overall, over 160 million acres were given away free to homesteaders. Again, on the condition that they had to do something with the land. They couldn't just claim it and then live in New York City or something like that. So we get all sorts of pioneer stories and poems from this time period. And you've already read one of them, Walt Whitman's Pioneers, O Pioneers, a few months ago. We covered that. The Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which was a hugely popular children's book series. It takes place around this time too. In those books, Laura Ingalls recalls what life was like on one of these homesteads as a young girl, her father having taken the government up on the offer of free land. So you should definitely check those books out if you haven't done so already. They're children's books, but they're good reads as for adults as well. Now, Willa Cather's family didn't move out to Nebraska until later. They moved in 1883, and her father only tried farming for a few months before he realized that it wasn't for him, and so the family then moved to the town of Red Cloud instead of being on their own farmland. And as a child and as a teenager, Willa was an extensive reader and also a writer. She was able to get some of her stories published in the local newspaper even before she'd gone away to college. And she went to college at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, still writing, although she was going to be a nurse at the time, I believe. She was studying medicine. And afterwards, when she decided that she wanted to be a writer, she moved back east to Pittsburgh, where she wrote short stories, poems, and journalism for a woman's magazine there. Even though she had moved east, though, her imagination still seems to have been taken up by her childhood home on the Great Plains, by the weather, the culture, and the vastness of the prairie. And as I mentioned earlier, some of her most well-known fiction takes place on the prairies, though her writing wasn't exclusive to that. Like with Sarah Orne Jewett, and with Bret Harte, who we read both of them last week, she was able to capture the atmosphere and the plain-spoken language of the people whose lives she was depicting, making her part of the local color genre that we've already discussed. It was actually Sarah Jewett, who Cather knew, who recommended her to write about her own country and her own experiences there. Cather admired Jewett, although in general she didn't take to most female writers. So she took up her advice and decided to write a work of fiction based on a real-life girl from an immigrant family that she had known in her childhood. And this was the basis of My Antonia. Now, we should keep in mind that there probably isn't a direct point-by-point correlation between Antonia in the novel and the girl that Cather knew, whose name was Annie Pavelka. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that. But they follow the same general life trajectory. Similar things happened to both of them. But I also think it's important to point out that Antonia is a complete and compelling literary creation in her own right. So, we meet Antonia, and I've heard her name pronounced differently from different people talking about this book. Antonia, Antonia, Antonia. I'm not sure what the right pronunciation is because it seems to be everybody just making it up as they go. So however you want to pronounce it, it's fine. So we meet her and her family, the Shimerdas. Again, I'm unsure of the proper pronunciation. But they are Bohemian immigrants to Nebraska through the eyes, and we meet them through the eyes of the narrator of the story, Jim Burden. The novel is built around a sort of frame narrative where the first narrator, presumably Cather herself, runs into Jim, who is an old friend. And as they're reminiscing about the childhood that they spent together in the town of Black Hawk, which is a fictional stand-in for the real-life town of Red Cloud, their conversation turns toward the people that they knew in their childhood. And during this, Jim suggests to Cather that she write a story about Antonia. Since she's now a professional writer, why not? And Cather says, well, you knew her better. Maybe you should write about her. And Jim goes, maybe I will. And we might be thinking, well, what's so special about this girl, right? Why is Jim making the suggestion that Cather write about her? Why are they discussing this at all? Cather says that more than anybody else that they had known in their childhood, Antonia seemed to represent the country and the conditions and all the adventures of their childhood the best. So if she's trying to depict her childhood and the prairie in which she grew up to all of her readers, over on the East Coast, to paint the story of the life of Antonia is the best way to do it, Jim seems to be saying. But Jim writes this story, and he delivers a manuscript to this narrator, again, presumably it's Cather, and it's titled My Antonia. And I think that the "my" is significant. He says that this is the story of the girl as he remembers her, and as she was connected to him. So he's not making any attempts at an objective biography, but just relating the impression that she had on him as he was growing up. So we're only ever going to see her through his eyes. So after this frame narrative is set up, the real story begins, taking us back to Jim's first trip out west when he's a young boy. He's an orphan, and he's going to live with his grandparents on their farm. And we meet a couple of other interesting characters who also work on the farm. It's interesting that they all seem to come from somewhere else, the Appalachian Mountains, from Germany, and so on. But Jim spends more time talking about his grandparents' neighbors, the Shimerdas. They're, as I said before, an immigrant family who can hardly speak any English and who have been kind of misled into settling on a homestead that doesn't even have a home built on it yet. And from the picture that we get of them, they don't seem to be that suited to farming or to the prairie life. The father doesn't even want to be there. He was apparently urged along by his wife, and he misses his homeland and he's depressed. The mother isn't very pleasant and is suspicious of her neighbors. The oldest son is kind of unpleasant and surly as well. He's named Ambrose. And one of the other sons has some sort of a mental disability. So that's an added factor that they have to worry about on top of how they're going to farm and how they're going to build a house. The oldest daughter, Antonia, becomes friends with Jim, and he gives her lessons in English over the course of the first year that they're neighbors. That's how this friendship of theirs starts. And it's interesting to see the various interactions that arise between these farmers from vastly different cultures. And it's not just the Shimerdas who are immigrants. There are Russian farmers that we get to learn about. There are Norwegians. It seems like everybody is from somewhere else. And not only are their cultures different, their religions are different too. We see a sort of strain between Jim's grandfather, who's a firm Protestant, and the Shimerdas, who are Catholic, whenever a situation arises that highlights the differences between their faiths. This is especially evident when Mr. Shimerda kills himself and Jim's grandfather is asked to conduct the funeral. He's got to balance kind of a fine line between saying what he really believes and not wanting to offend Mrs. Shimerda by doing something that would be contrary to the Catholic practices at this funeral. And there are various misunderstandings between Jim and Antonia as well, not just language barrier differences either. Jim wants to think of them as equals, as both being in a similar boat, but the way Antonia behaves shows that she thinks of herself as older and more mature than Jim. She is older, but not by much. And also, she thinks that because she's an immigrant, her life is necessarily going to be more harder and in some aspects crueler than Jim's will ever be. So she kind of puts up this wall between the two of them. I want to mention how prominent of a role the environment itself has in the novel, though. Now, how Jim, a boy who grew up again in Virginia, reacts to his new surroundings on the prairie. We get the sense that there's endless possibilities there, that the world has come to an end and that he feels almost untethered from reality. When he first arrives, it's nighttime, and he thinks this. He says, I had the feeling that the world was left behind, that we had got over the edge of it and were outside man's jurisdiction. I had never before looked up at the sky when there was not a familiar mountain ridge against it. But this was the complete dome of heaven, all there was of it. I did not believe that my dead father and mother were watching me from up there. They would still be looking for me at the sheepfold down by the creek, or along the white road that led to the mountain pastures. I had left even their spirits behind me. The wagon jolted on, carrying me I knew not whither. I don't think I was homesick. If we never arrived anywhere, it did not matter. Between that earth and that sky, I felt erased, blotted out. I did not say my prayers that night. Here, I felt, what would be, would be. So this emptiness is what really shocks him, and the sense of his own insignificance in the face of it. A little bit later, as he's laying in his garden, he says something similar. He says, I wanted to walk straight on through the red grass and over the edge of the world, which could not be very far away. The light air about me told me that the world ended here. Only the ground and sun and sky were left, and if one went a little farther, there would be only sun and sky, and one would float off into them, like the tawny hawks which sailed over our heads, making slow shadows on the grass. A little bit further down he says, Nothing happened. I did not expect anything to happen. I was something that lay under the sun and felt it, like the pumpkins, and I did not want to be anything more. I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel like that when we die and become a part of something entire, whether it is sun and air or goodness and knowledge. At any rate, this is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. When it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep. These emotions that he's feeling and that he's trying to describe here or that Cather is trying to describe through him, may be familiar. Maybe we felt this way, but they're a bit hard to put into words. I would say that Jim is experiencing what the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke described as the sublime. And that's a sense of overwhelming awe in the face of nature that's both exciting, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. I think we'll talk more about the idea of the sublime during our next meeting. But notice how this idea, again, could be just as scary as it is relaxing. He feels that he's lost himself in the prairie, that his own identity has somehow faded away. So imagine how the Shimerdas must feel, right? Having come from a home much farther away than Virginia and settling down among strangers who don't even speak their language. So, that will be it for this lecture. For the next time, read part 2 of the novel and we'll discuss it then. Thanks.